Hey guys, tonight we wake not to birdsong or a golden sunrise, but to a sky that looks like someone smeared soot across the heavens. The year is AD 536, and before you even yawn the stiffness from your straw bed away, you realize something's wrong. The air feels chillier than it should, the sun, if that's what that dim disk is, barely cuts through the gloom. Farmers are already muttering, merchants squint upward, and you're about to find out why historians call this one of the worst years to be alive. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this one without at least losing your appetite, so, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I love picturing listeners all over the world. Maybe you're under bright modern lights while I'm walking you through a sky that never really wakes up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step outside. The morning should be crisp, but it's colder than yesterday, colder than last month. Mainstream fact: Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. Imagine a year-long twilight, no sharp shadows, no warm rays, just a constant pale glow. Historians still argue whether this was truly global or exaggerated in some texts. But accounts from Ireland to China repeat the same story: a sun dimmed, crops withering, people unsettled, your neighbors stand in the square, staring upward. The sun should climb with confidence, yet it looms dull and small, as if hidden behind gauze. Quirky tidbit: some chronicles describe stars visible at midday, a ghostly sky so dim you could see the constellations while tending fields. You point out faint dots to your friend, and joke one slips out. Well, at least you don't need to wait for night to ruin your neck looking at Orion. But this isn't a passing cloud. Days blur into weeks, and the gloom doesn't lift. Farmers measure shadows at noon and find nothing sharp enough to time their work. Merchants complain that even candle sales can't keep up with demand. You laugh grimly, joke too, guess it's always golden hour now, just without the golden. Cold creeps into your bones. Summer feels like autumn, autumn like winter. Mainstream fact again: tree ring evidence shows a sudden, dramatic cooling beginning in 536, with some regions dropping average temperatures by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. Historians still argue whether this qualifies as the coldest decade in 2 millennia, but it was catastrophic enough to be felt across continents. Nights stretch long. Fires burn in every hearth, smoke hanging low since the air itself seems heavier. People whisper omens: punishment from heaven, a swallowed sun, a world ending slowly rather than in a bang. You lie awake, wrapped in rough blankets, wondering if light will ever return. Joke 3 drifts through your teeth as you try to sleep: if this is the sun's vacation, it picked the worst possible time to take it. The next day dawns, or tries to. You step outside and glance at the sky, but the sun looks more like a pale coin rubbed thin by too many hands. Noon comes and yet there are no shadows, no warmth, no clarity. The world feels stuck in an endless twilight. Mainstream fact: multiple contemporary sources confirm this eerie dimness. Cassiodorus in Italy wrote about a sun without rays, while a Syriac chronicle said the sun became dark and its darkness lasted 18 months. Historians still argue whether all regions experienced this equally or whether certain latitudes bore the brunt, but the impression was shared. The sky itself seemed broken. You wander down a road, watching villagers tilt their faces upward. A merchant mutters that his sundial is useless. A monk insists that the Last Judgment must be near. Quirky tidbit: in Ireland, annals describe a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539, implying that famine coincided with skies so dim that farming cycles were ruined. Imagine kneeling in a field, trying to tell if wheat is ripe when the sun never brightens. Even at midday, you can spot Venus faintly glimmering, a star that shouldn't belong to daytime. Birds seem confused, calling at odd hours, crops grow weak and spindly. You realize this isn't just inconvenience, it's a full ecological crisis. Joke 1 slips from your lips as you squint upward. Great, the universe just switched us all to mood lighting without asking. Farmers start planting by guesswork, hoping soil and season align. Mainstream fact again, studies of European and Asian harvest records show repeated crop failures from 536 onward, worsening through the decade. Historians still argue whether volcanic dust or comet debris caused the dark skies, but the result was the same: shorter growing seasons, hungry bellies. In the square, a preacher shouts that the sun has been swallowed by a dragon. Children gasp, adults cross themselves or bow in prayer. Quirky tidbit again, in Chinese chronicles, reports mention frost in midsummer, as if the heavens themselves had shifted balance. It wasn't just gloom, it was cold. Days pass, and you notice how people move slower, conserving strength. Even animals seem unsettled, cows refusing to graze, chickens laying less. The rhythm of life is offbeat, the metronome of the sun broken. You stumble through your own chores, wondering how long you can endure a world without true day. Joke 2 stirs as you pass a flickering candle in broad daylight. At this point, I think the Candlemakers Guild owes the volcano a thank you note. Evening brings little difference, it's already dim, already cold. Fires burn in hearths long before sunset. The stars blaze oddly bright against the half-lit horizon. Historians still argue whether people thought the sky was poisoned or cursed, but for you, it feels like a lid has been placed over the world, keeping life small and uncertain. You lie awake again, restless, staring at the ceiling. The absence of shadows weighs heavier than their presence ever did. Joke 3 drifts softly as sleep creeps close. Honestly, the sun needs to stop ghosting us and just show up. The gloom hangs heavy, and you start asking the question everyone whispers: what on earth, or above it, caused this dim sun? You tilt your head skyward, but the haze is too high to see. The truth lies far above, in the stratosphere, where a veil of ash and aerosols has wrapped the planet in a shroud. Mainstream fact: modern scientists reading ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica have found spikes in volcanic sulfate deposits beginning in 536, pointing toward a massive eruption. Historians still argue which volcano it was. Candidates include Iceland, El Salvador's Ilopango, or other unconfirmed eruptions, but the evidence shows something catastrophic belched material into the upper atmosphere. Blocking sunlight worldwide, you picture it, a mountain exploding with such force that its guts painted the sky. Quirky tidbit: some researchers suggest it wasn't just one eruption but a double punch, 536 and again in 540, creating years of gloom. You try to imagine living through both, and Joke 1 mutters out, so basically, the Earth double-booked our apocalypse. The signs of fallout are everywhere. Sunlight filtered through high-altitude dust makes the sky look milky, almost metallic. People describe halos around the sun and moon, ghostly rings that terrify villagers who think the heavens are bleeding. Mainstream fact again: Byzantine records describe dimmed light and unusual atmospheric phenomena, consistent with volcanic aerosols. Historians still argue whether a comet impact added debris, since some chronicles speak of fiery omens streaking across the sky. You walk past a group of peasants debating. One swears he saw a dragon coil around the sun. Another insists the gods have sealed the sky. You shrug, thinking of eruptions no one here can even imagine. Quirky tidbit again: Ilopango's eruption centuries earlier reshaped Central America, proving volcanoes could indeed devastate civilizations far beyond their slopes. At night, you sit by a fire and picture particles drifting in the stratosphere, scattering light, cooling the ground. It's science to us, sorcery to them. Joke 2 slips out: if you've ever wondered what happens when the Earth forgets to clean its atmosphere, welcome to the year-long dust bunny. The consequences grow clearer. Temperatures drop, rains falter, and crops refuse to ripen. Mainstream fact once more: Tree ring records across Europe and Asia show 536 as one of the coldest years in recorded history. Historians still argue whether people understood any connection between volcanoes and weather. They likely didn't, but they felt the chill in their bones. As you crawl beneath your blanket, you realize you're not just living through bad weather. You're inside a global experiment no one asked for, a reminder that nature's tantrums ripple everywhere. You close your eyes, muttering joke 3, honestly, if the earth wanted us all to go palea, this is an overreaction. The sun stays ghostly pale, and you begin to notice subtler signs of the disaster. You walk into a forest and trail your fingers across the bark of oaks and pines. The rings tell a story, thinner, paler, stunted. Trees don't lie. They record every bad year in their bones, and 536 has carved itself deep into their growth. Mainstream fact, dendrochronology, tree ring analysis, shows dramatic shrinkage in growth rings worldwide beginning in 536. From Scandinavia to Mongolia, trees barely grew, reflecting shorter, colder seasons. Historians still argue whether this climate dip was truly global or worse in the northern hemisphere, but the record is stark. Nature itself froze mid-sentence. You notice farmers struggling nearby. Sprouts stay small, grains barely rise above the soil. Sheep nibble hungrily but grow thin, their pastures too poor. Quirky tidbit, Icelandic tree stumps and bog samples show summer temperatures barely above freezing, so cold that locals joked summer had simply gone on vacation. You try to laugh along, muttering joke 1, well, guess we'll just pencil in July for December next time. Walking farther, you find charcoal pits abandoned, woodcutters idle. Without strong growth, timber is weak, firewood scarce. Mainstream fact again, pollen records confirm reduced vegetation across Europe during this period. Historians still argue whether volcanic aerosols alone caused the drop, or whether ocean circulation shifts deepened the cooling. Either way, people felt it in every splinter and seed. At night, villagers huddle around stunted wood fires, rationing what little they've chopped. Smoke fills low huts, and children cough in the gloom. Quirky tidbit again, Norse sagas and Irish annals both mention famine winters where frost struck at harvest time, ruining the year's work. You picture farmers standing in frozen fields, staring at half-grown barley turned brittle. The trees whisper the truth, they've been starved of sunlight. Their rings, like notches in a diary, shrink to half their size. To you, it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. Joke 2 slips out as you watch a farmer measure his stunted cabbages. Honestly, this is the worst farm-to-table experience in history. Scholars centuries later will read these tree rings like crime scene evidence, layering them with ice cores and chronicles. But for you in the moment, it's just hunger creeping closer. Mainstream fact once more, some tree ring sequences suggest multiple years of suppressed growth stretching into the 540s, confirming that recovery was slow and painful. Historians still argue how societies endured, migration, adaptation, or collapse, but the evidence shows resilience tested to the edge. You lie beneath a thinning oak that offers little shelter, staring through skeletal branches at a sky that refuses to clear. Joke 3 drifts across your lips as sleep tugs. Great, even the trees are phoning it in this year. The forest rings tell their quiet story, but human voices add sharper notes. You sit by a fire with monks copying annals, their quills scratching grim phrases. Failure of bread, a year without summer, dim stars at noon. Across Ireland, Syria, Italy, the records echo like a chorus of despair. Mainstream fact, the annals of Ulster mention a failure of bread in 536 to 539, while Procopius in Byzantium described the dim sun, and a Syriac chronicle said the sun was dark for 18 months. Historians still argue whether these were literal descriptions or symbolic laments, but the overlap across distant regions is chilling. You picture a scribe in a drafty monastery, staring at a darkened sky, deciding whether to blame God or just write what he sees. Quirky tidbit, One Irish annal notes not just famine but a great mortality of birds, as if even the skies above the gloom were losing their creatures. You glance upward nervously and mutter joke 1, perfect, first no bread, now no birds. At this rate we'll be writing annals about the disappearance of joy. Farmers gather in villages to trade stories. One claims frost hit his fields in August. Another insists his sheep miscarried from hunger. The monks nod and record it all. Mainstream fact again, chronicles from China mention drought, frost, and locusts around the same period, reinforcing the global scope. Historians still argue whether this was coincidence or fallout from the same volcanic haze. But the timing is too close to ignore. You listen to rumors that stretch truth thin. Some say the stars have grown angry. Others whisper that demons blot the sun. Quirky tidbit again, a Syriac writer claimed the dim sun was so weak that men neither cast shadow nor face shone, poetic lines that sound like science fiction but reflect lived fear. At night, you read by candle, hearing the quill scratch the same phrase again and again, hunger, famine, pestilence. The rhythm becomes hypnotic, despair captured in ink. Joke 2 slips as you watch monks trade ink pots. Honestly, they should just copy bread failed on repeat and save parchment. And yet, even in gloom, life tries to cling. Some notes describe processions, fasting, prayers for mercy. Mainstream fact once more, church responses included extra fasts, penitential rites, and appeals to saints, all reflecting how people tied cosmic events to moral failings. Historians still argue whether such responses helped psychologically or simply deepened fear, but they gave people something to do. You close your eyes, the fire flickering low, and imagine the annals of your own life. Would you write today was dim again, or would you try a joke to keep yourself sane? Joke 3 sneaks out as sleep overtakes you. If the scribes survive this, future historians are going to think we were all really bad poets. You wake hungry, your stomach growling louder than the roosters. The grain bins are thin, the loaves smaller, and the bread line longer than yesterday. You shuffle forward, clutching a few coins, hoping the market still has enough to sell. Mainstream fact, written sources from across Europe and the Middle East record soaring grain prices after 536. Harvests failed repeatedly, and famine spread. In Constantinople, food shortages strained the empire's resources. Historians still argue whether the worst hunger struck in rural fields or crowded cities, but the misery was everywhere. You reach the market stalls, half empty. The baker frowns, shaking his head. What loaves remain are crumbly, baked from barley and beans stretched thin. Quirky tidbit, desperate bakers sometimes mixed ground acorns, ferns, or even tree bark into bread. You bite into one such loaf, gritty between your teeth, and joke 1 coughs out, nothing like a slice of oak-flavored misery toast. Beside you, merchants complain of stalled ships. Fog and storms choke harbors, slowing grain imports. Caravan traders mutter about unsafe roads, blaming both brigands and weather. Mainstream fact again, famine often rippled through trade networks, because when one region failed, another could no longer supply relief. Historians still argue whether political decisions, like hoarding or taxation, made things worse than climate alone. As the day drags, you notice children with hollow cheeks, farmers pawning tools, neighbors bartering clothes for scraps of grain. Quirky tidbit again, one Byzantine edict tried to regulate bread prices, but bakers simply shrank loaf sizes to keep profit. You imagine paying the same for bread the size of a fist, muttering joke 2, congrats, you invented the medieval fun-size snack. The hunger gnaws deeper. People turn to roots, nettles, and thin gruel. Some chew leather scraps softened in broth. Fires burn longer as families boil weeds into soup. Mainstream fact once more, famines killed not only through starvation but also through weakened immunity, disease following close behind. Historians still argue whether famine deaths in the 530s outnumbered later plague deaths, but both were fueled by this decade of gloom. At night, you scrape the bottom of your bowl, staring into broth so thin you can see the wood beneath. Joke 3 slides from your lips, weary but defiant. Honestly, if I ever see a decent loaf again, I'm giving it a standing ovation. The market stalls shrink by the day, but the empire carries on. You walk through the marble avenues of Constantinople, the great capital of Justinian, where even grandeur can't hide the gloom. Smoke clings to the city like a veil, and the sun overhead is still that pale disk, casting no real shadow. Mainstream fact: Justinian I reigned from 527 to 565, overseeing ambitious projects like the Hagia Sophia's construction. Yet his reign was marked by crises, including the dim skies of 536 and, a few years later, the devastating plague. Historians still argue whether his empire's struggles were due more to environmental catastrophe or his overreaching policies, but the timing is cruel. You stroll past laborers hauling stone. The great church rises, scaffolding reaching into the gray air. Its dome is meant to capture light, but right now, the gloom makes it feel like a lantern with no flame. Quirky tidbit: builders sometimes smeared fresh mortar with vinegar-soaked cloth to test strength, a practice that, in 536, was mocked as flavoring the famine. You chuckle dryly, joke 1 slipping out, well, at least if the walls collapse, we can lick them for seasoning. Merchants line the forums, their wares sparse. Grain prices spike daily, olive oil jars sit dusty. Justinian issues edicts capping prices, threatening punishment for hoarding. Mainstream fact again: records mention imperial attempts to regulate the grain market during shortages. Historians still argue whether these efforts stabilized supply or simply drove trade underground, but resentment simmered either way. Crowds gather around preachers in the hippodrome, some crying that God punishes the empire for its sins. Soldiers patrol, watchful for riots. Quirky tidbit again: astrologers in the city claimed the dim sun heralded political upheaval, fueling rumors of conspiracies and plots. You overhear one man whisper, "The emperor's crown is darker than the sky." Joke 2 rises, great, now even the weather's in on palace gossip. Even at night, unease spreads. Candles flicker in every home, their greasy smoke thick in the alleys. Priests lead processions, chanting prayers to lift the shadow. You follow, clutching a taper, the wax dripping hot on your fingers. Mainstream fact once more: urban life in Constantinople was fragile in crises, densely packed. Reliant on imports, quick to riot. Historians still argue whether 536 pushed the empire closer to instability that erupted later. You return home to your cramped room, listening to hammers echo late into the night as Hagia Sophia's dome climbs higher. You sigh, thinking how a church meant to capture divine light now struggles in a world where the sun itself is dimmed. Joke 3 drifts from your lips: honestly, if Justinian pulls this off, he deserves credit for building a skylight in permanent twilight. You leave the crowded avenues of Constantinople behind and follow the ancient arteries of trade stretching eastward. The Silk Roads, once alive with jingling caravans, bells on camels, and the chatter of merchants in dozens of tongues, feel strangely subdued. The world's dimmed sun has slowed more than crops, it has dimmed the hum of commerce itself. Mainstream fact: the Silk Roads connected Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, carrying not only silk but spices, gems, paper, and ideas. In times of famine or climate stress, trade faltered as both supply and demand shrank. Historians still argue whether the climate downturn of 536 directly disrupted long-distance exchange or whether wars and politics bore equal blame. But it's clear the network suffered. You trudge alongside a caravan of weary camels. Their loads are lighter than usual, silks replaced with sacks of grain or dried fish. Quirky tidbit: some merchants joked they were hauling famine east and west, since every market they reached was already starving. You shake your head and mutter joke 1, well, nothing like shipping misery internationally. free delivery included. Along the route, inns that once overflowed with goods and gossip now stand half empty. Fires burn low, traders speak in hushed tones. Mainstream fact again, archaeology in Central Asia shows settlements shrinking or abandoned in the mid-6th century, possibly linked to trade collapse. Historians still argue whether this was driven mainly by climate disruption or shifting nomadic powers, but the timing aligns with the dark skies. Crossing into steppe lands, you see camps of nomads moving restlessly. Horses graze on thin pastures, herds smaller than elders remember. Quirky tidbit again, Chinese chronicles mention northern tribes suffering from frost and drought in the 530s, conditions that could push migration southward. You picture displaced groups rippling along the trade routes, pressuring empires already short on bread. At a desert oasis, merchants argue over whether to risk continuing. Some claim brigands prowl more boldly now, knowing caravans are weaker. Others whisper that famine makes even allies dangerous. You sip from a cracked cup, the water brackish, and joke 2 slips out, perfect, starve at home or get robbed on the road. Truly a medieval vacation package. Still, not all is silence. A few bold traders push onward, hoping scarcity will make their wares fetch higher prices. Spices sell for fortunes when meat is rotting without salt. Candles double in value when days are dim. Mainstream fact once more, crises sometimes boosted niche trades even as others collapsed. Historians still argue whether this resilience kept the Silk Roads alive or merely prolonged their suffering. As you walk into another gray dawn, the road stretches endless, quieter than you remember. The great arteries of the world still pulse, but faintly, sluggishly, as though the planet itself is too tired to trade. Joke 3 drifts from your lips. Weary but wry, honestly, if the world's economy had a status right now, it'd just say, buffering. The road east leads you to another empire shadowed by the dim sun, northern China, where officials scribble frantic reports of skies gone wrong. You arrive in a village outside Luoyang, and the mood is grim. Farmers crouch in their fields, shaking their heads over withered shoots, while elders recall omens of dynasties rising and falling. Mainstream fact, Chinese chronicles, including those from the Northern Wei dynasty, describe frost in summer, drought, and locust plagues in the 530s. These combined disasters devastated crops and strained already fragile political orders. Historians still argue whether these accounts directly tie to the 536 event or reflect local cycles, but their timing is uncannily close. You bend to examine a row of millet plants, barely ankle-high in what should be lush fields. The farmer mutters that snow fell just weeks ago, in the middle of summer. Quirky tidbit, one chronicle mentions rivers drying at the same time heavy frost appeared, a paradox that baffled observers. You scratch your head and joke 1, so we've got freezing heat waves and thirsty floods. Great, the weather just installed chaos mode. At the granary, officials tally dwindling stores. The tax collector argues for full quotas, while hungry villagers protest they have nothing left. Mainstream fact again, taxation in times of famine often deepened crises, as rulers demanded grain even when harvests failed. Historians still argue whether such policies sparked migrations or rebellions, but the records show unrest spreading. Locusts cloud the sky one afternoon, swarming fields already ruined by frost. You wave your arms, but the insects eat greedily, undeterred. Quirky tidbit again, some Chinese remedies included banging drums to scare locusts or praying to river gods, both rituals that gave hope if not results. You grin weakly, muttering joke 2, honestly, if the bugs survive this year better than we do, they deserve the empire. At night, you sit in a scholar's hall as he debates with colleagues. One insists the dim sun signals heaven's displeasure with the dynasty. Another claims natural cycles explain the oddities. Mainstream fact once more, Chinese historiography often tied disasters to the mandate of heaven. Linking cosmic events to political legitimacy. Historians still argue whether this was sincere belief or a convenient way to frame rebellions. You sip weak tea, staring into the gloom outside. The scholar sighs, saying his grandchildren may never see a normal summer. You nod, exhausted, whispering joke 3 into the dim air. At this rate, I think the mandate of heaven has been put on hold until further notice. The Silk Roads behind you and China's frost still in memory, you wander into the countryside, where daily survival plays out on smaller scales. A farmyard greets you with silence, no cheerful clucking, no bleating sheep, only the shuffle of thin cattle chewing straw as if pretending it's grass. The family here works from dawn till dusk, but their fields whisper failure. Mainstream fact, subsistence agriculture was the backbone of 6th century life, and when climate shock struck, households felt it first. Yields dropped, animals weakened, and famine rippled outward. Historians still argue whether communities adapted through creative substitutions or if collapse was near total, but evidence of malnutrition and crop substitution abounds. You kneel to examine a basket of grain, small, shriveled kernels, not nearly enough to feed a family, let alone pay tax. Quirky tidbit, some people boiled grass seeds, moss, or even ground bones into flour. Bread turned gray, soup's bitter, but at least the pot wasn't empty. You taste a ladle of weed broth, gagging slightly, and joke 1 bubbles out, well, at least it's gluten-free, organic, and utterly inedible. Animals suffer too. Sheep stand gaunt, their wool thin and patchy. Chickens peck listlessly at bare ground. A farmer sharpens a knife with regret, forced to slaughter early rather than feed what he cannot sustain. Mainstream fact again, mass livestock die-offs are recorded in some chronicles after 536, compounding famine with loss of draft animals and hides. Historians still argue whether disease or starvation killed more flocks, but the effect was devastating. By midday, you walk fields where families bend low, plucking weeds for the cooking pot. Children chase locusts to roast as snacks. Quirky tidbit again, in some places, insects became famine food, roasted for crunch or ground into flour. You wince at the thought, muttering joke 2, if 536 invented protein bars, they definitely came with extra legs. Evenings are the hardest. Families sit in smoky huts, counting out shriveled beans, stretching thin gruel across too many mouths. The fire is weak, the pot nearly empty. Parents tell folktales to distract children from hunger, while neighbors trade rumors of miracle cures or saints' blessings. Mainstream fact once more, famine folklore often blended hope with desperation, from charms to saints invoked for rain. Historians still argue whether such traditions provided comfort or wasted precious energy, but their persistence shows they mattered. You curl in straw beside the family. Stomach hollow, head pounding. Joke 3 drifts from your lips as you try to ignore the sound of your own gut growling. Honestly, I think the rats from last week's story are eating better than we are. The hunger gnaws, but even worse is the sense that the heavens themselves have turned hostile. You join a crowd in a town square where priests chant, astrologers scribble charts, and common folk point anxiously at the sky. The year 536 is not just about famine, it feels like the cosmos itself is delivering omens. Mainstream fact, in both Christian and non-Christian regions, unusual celestial events were tied to divine will or cosmic order. The dimmed sun became a sign of wrath, punishment, or transition. Historians still argue whether the records of eclipses and dragons eating the sun reflect volcanic haze or actual astronomical events, but to medieval eyes, the meaning was moral. You watch a preacher thunder that sin has darkened the sky. Behind him, an astrologer insists the planets foretell regime change. Quirky tidbit, in some Syriac communities, people rang bells or clanged pots to scare off cosmic dragons thought to be devouring the sun. The crowd bangs pans with vigor, and you mutter joke 1, well, at least it doubles as a noise complaint against the apocalypse. Traveling further, you meet monks copying scrolls that list portents, faint stars visible at noon, halos circling the moon, colors in the sky like blood. Mainstream fact again, Byzantine chroniclers describe the pale sun and weak light, while Chinese records mention red skies and frosts. All folded into interpretations of heaven's will. Historians still argue whether cometary debris played a role, as some texts mention fiery streaks and falling stars. Even ordinary folk see meaning everywhere. A black goat born with two heads. A sign. Rivers drying suddenly. A sign. Children falling ill. Another sign. Quirky tidbit again, some saints were credited with halting eclipses simply by raising a hand, their reputations soaring as fast as crops failed. You raise your own hand mockingly, joke 2 slipping out, if this works, I expect free bread for life. At night, you join a vigil. The crowd gathers under the dim sky, torches flickering, chanting prayers to saints and gods alike. Some weep, others sing, others simply stare at the pale disk above. Mainstream fact once more, rituals, penance, and fasts became widespread responses to perceived cosmic anger. Historians still argue whether these built resilience by binding communities together or deepened despair when the skies stayed unchanged. You walk home afterward, ears ringing with bells, stomach empty, and mind buzzing with omens. The sky offers no answers, just endless twilight. Joke 3 drifts out like smoke. Honestly, if heaven wanted to send us a message, it could have used clearer handwriting. The skies stay dim, the bread lines stay long, and then a new horror arrives. You wake one morning in 541 to hear whispers of a sickness creeping through ports, carried on ships and trade winds. Soon, Constantinople groans under the weight of plague. The famine has weakened bodies, and now disease finds easy purchase. Mainstream fact, the Justinianic plague, beginning in 541 to 542, is considered one of history's first pandemics, killing millions across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. It was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium later behind the Black Death. Historians still argue how much the volcanic climate downturn of 536 weakened societies and contributed to the plague spread. But the overlap is striking. You walk past the harbor, where rats scuttle among sacks of grain. Fleas ride their backs, unseen but lethal. Quirky tidbit, some chroniclers claim the plague began when phantoms poured through the air, a poetic attempt to explain unseen microbes. You sweat the air nervously, muttering joke 1, fantastic, first the sun vanished, now the ghosts are contagious. Inside the city, bodies pile quickly. The dim light seems even more oppressive, casting long shadows in alleys lined with carts of the dead. Mainstream fact again, Procopius described corpses stacked in streets, burial grounds overflowing, and citizens too weak to dig graves. Historians still argue whether climate directly triggered plague outbreaks by shifting rodent populations or whether trade was the sole culprit, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. Markets close, workshops empty, prayers double in volume. Quirky tidbit again, some Byzantine households locked entire families inside for weeks, leaving food at the door to avoid contagion, a medieval version of quarantine. You imagine weeks trapped in your smoky room and joke 2 comes out, honestly, I think I'd die of boredom before the plague. The empire reels. Justinian himself contracts the disease but survives, though many of his subjects are not so lucky. Famine has already gnawed at supplies. And now disease shreds what strength remains. Mainstream fact once more, estimates suggest up to half of Constantinople's population perished, with ripple effects across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Historians still argue whether this pandemic truly reshaped empires or merely accelerated existing trends, but its shadow is undeniable. At night, you sit by a guttering candle, the city outside silent except for the creak of plague carts. You clutch your blanket, whispering joke 3 into the gloom. At this point, I'm starting to think 536 was just the trailer and this is the full horror movie. The plague gnaws at the empire, but the sky hasn't finished its cruel tricks. Just as whispers of recovery stir, fresh blows fall in the years 540 and 547. You step outside one morning, hoping for a brighter sun, only to find the gloom deepen again, as if some unseen hand keeps shaking ash into the sky. Mainstream fact: ice core records show new volcanic sulfate spikes in 540 and again in 547, suggesting additional massive eruptions followed the one in 536. These aftershocks prolonged the cold decade, turning what might have been a short crisis into a generation's ordeal. Historians still argue which volcanoes erupted. Candidates range from El Salvador's Ilopango to Iceland, but the global fingerprints are clear. You wander fields where farmers, already battered by years of thin harvests, find themselves facing another cycle of frost and failed grain. Quirky tidbit: some annals describe rivers freezing in summer, an eerie repetition of earlier reports. You shake your head and mutter joke 1, perfect, winters on a subscription plan now, auto-renewing every few years. In distant monasteries, scribes note these recurring dark years, puzzled that the world won't return to normal. Mainstream fact again: tree rings from Scandinavia and Mongolia confirm suppressed growth well into the 540s, creating what some scientists call the late antique Little Ice Age. Historians still argue whether these eruptions were connected events or unlucky coincidences. But they left a deep scar across continents. You meet traders who swear their children have never seen a proper summer. For them, hunger is simply life now. Quirky tidbit again: folklore born in this period sometimes described as sun-veiled in mourning cloth, turning a scientific anomaly into a cultural metaphor that endured. You smile weakly, joke 2 slipping out: honestly, the sun should have just sent us a breakup letter instead of ghosting us for a decade. By 547, despair and resilience are entangled. Some communities migrate, chasing fertile land. Others double down, inventing new farming methods or shifting diets. Mainstream fact once more: archaeology shows shifts in settlement patterns and crop choices across Europe and Asia during this era, suggesting adaptation even amid disaster. Historians still argue how much of this was directly tied to volcanic cooling or broader political shifts, but survival meant change. That night, you sit by a flickering fire, the stars faint above the eternal haze. You sigh, thinking of all the people born since 536 who have never known a normal sky. Joke 3 drifts out as you curl under your blanket: if anyone ever writes a travel guide for this century, the weather section's just going to say, don't bother. The ash, the famines, the plagues, by now you'd expect the story to end in collapse. But as you walk through villages and towns, you begin to notice something else: people adjusting, surviving, even reinventing ways of life. For all the misery, there is resilience stitched through the gloom. Mainstream fact: archaeological and textual evidence shows that while many communities suffered, others adapted by shifting crops, migrating, or restructuring their economies. Historians still argue whether these changes were temporary coping mechanisms or lasting transformations that shaped the early medieval world, but they reveal human tenacity. You sit with farmers experimenting with barley instead of wheat, or planting peas that can endure harsher weather. Quirky tidbit: some households even kept bees more seriously during this period, relying on honey as both food and trade, since grain was scarce. You dip a finger into a pot of thin honey and mutter joke 1, finally, something sweet that isn't another bowl of boiled weeds. In towns, new laws emerge. Rulers adjust taxes, forgiving some debts or encouraging resettlement. Mainstream fact again: Justinian issued relief measures in the empire, and in other regions, leaders used religious rituals or land grants to shore up loyalty during crisis. Historians still argue whether such measures were genuine aid or political calculation, but they kept societies functioning. Communities also turn inward for strength. Processions and festivals, even under a dim sky, bind people together. Quirky tidbit again: in some monasteries, monks brewed extra beer as a safe calorie source, joking that liquid bread never fails. You sip a cup, grimacing at the sour taste, and joke 2, honestly, if this is medieval craft beer, I'd rather stay thirsty. You notice, too, the growth of spiritual movements. Some cling to saints who promise protection, others look to astrology, others still retreat into contemplation. Mainstream fact once more, many historians link the upheavals of the 530s, 540s to surges in religious devotion, reforms, and even the spread of new ideologies. Historians still argue whether these were direct results of the climate shocks or part of longer patterns, but the timing is suggestive. As night falls, you sit in a hall where villagers share bread, mead, and songs despite thin supplies. The laughter is faint but real. It's proof that even in the worst year to be alive, people found ways to live. Joke 3 slips out as you raise your mug. Honestly, if we can laugh under a sun that forgot how to shine, we'll survive anything. The fires burn low, and you lean back, thinking about all you've seen, the dimmed sun, the withered fields, the plague carts, the empty caravans, and the small but stubborn ways people endured. The year 536 and its echoing decade has been called the worst year to be alive, but you realize the story doesn't end in darkness, it ends in memory, in lessons, in resilience. Mainstream fact, scientists today confirm the volcanic fingerprints in ice cores, match them with tree rings that shrank, and align them with chronicles describing dim skies. They compare this with later events, like Tambora's eruption in 1815, which caused the year without a summer. Historians still argue whether 536 was truly the absolute worst, or whether it simply stands out because of the global evidence, but its reputation remains powerful. You imagine researchers hunched over microscopes, reading bubbles of ancient air trapped in ice, or counting tree rings etched with thin lines of suffering. Quirky tidbit, one team of scientists described the ash veil as nature's sunshade, a phrase almost too casual for a decade of misery. You smile weakly, muttering joke 1, next time, maybe just invent umbrellas instead. The lesson lingers, societies are fragile, their networks easily shaken by climate, disease, and trade collapse. But people adapt, too, shifting fields, new prayers, unexpected jokes shared over bad beer. Mainstream fact again, the so-called late antique Little Ice Age stretched into the mid-7th century, shaping migrations, economies, and politics. Historians still argue how directly it caused empires to falter or faiths to spread, but its shadow influenced centuries, and so you lie back, looking up at the stars finally peeking through as the haze thins. Joke 2 escapes, soft, if we survived this cosmic dimmer switch, maybe the sun just wanted to remind us not to take it for granted. You breathe deep, knowing that the world did endure, scarred but alive. The story of 536 is not just one of endings but of continuations. Joke 3 whispers as your eyes close, honestly, the fact we're still telling this story means we won. Now let the weight of this dark decade ease away. The sky you've walked beneath all night, dim and uncertain, begins to soften. Imagine the haze lifting slowly, like curtains drawn open after too long. The pale disk of the sun brightens at last, its rays stretching, warming, promising. You step out of the village and walk into a quiet meadow. The grass is thin but glistens with dew, each drop catching a hint of returning light. The air is cool, gentle, steady, no longer biting or sharp. Each breath feels cleaner, each moment calmer, all the noise of famine, plague, and fear fades to memory. The carts are gone, the cries silenced, the arguments about omens hushed. What remains is only stillness, the kind that soothes rather than threatens. You are not digging, not hauling, not waiting in bread lines, you are simply resting, body safe, mind quiet. Ahead, a river flows gently, reflecting the first true blue of the sky in years. The water glimmers, slow and kind, carrying away ash, fear, and sorrow. You kneel, touch the cool surface, and feel its calm ripple through you. The meadow darkens again, but this time with night. Not ash. Stars scatter above, steady and brilliant. They've waited, patient, ready to remind you that light always returns, let your breathing slow to match the river's rhythm. Inhale deeply, feel your chest rise. Exhale softly, let your shoulders fall. Each breath carries you further from the noise, further into peace. The worst years pass. The sky clears. And here, in the quiet, you are safe. Close your eyes, drift gently, let sleep take you with the same calm certainty as dawn returning after endless twilight.